Hello, everyone. We're going to give folks just a minute to join us, and then we will get started on our series around wealthy conversations. All right, I'm gonna jump right in. For those who don't know me, Megan McCartan. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Hightower, and I love doing these sessions because I learned so much from all of them. I think that I will be learning in retrospect on this session because I did go through a very expensive divorce. That things could have gone a lot better. This session is not meant to be about divorce. This session is about to have strong conversations about money and build strong relationships around the topic of money at any point in your life with your partner. So I'm going to pop down, and Frances, I'm going to ask you to kind of go through a little bit of your background. Welcome, first of all. Thank you for joining us. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself, your practice, and why you're here with us.
Well, you're reminding me that I need a new headshot. I'm looking at that headshot. It doesn't even look like me anymore. My name is Frances Nolan. I am an attorney in private practice in Birmingham, Alabama. I am a member of a very small firm, 2 lawyers, 1 administrative person. Our focus is family law. That is a polite way of talking about divorce. That is the primary bread and butter of our work, is helping folks to navigate divorce. My particular specialty, if I'm lucky, is to focus on a collaborative divorce, which is a very unique approach to divorce that allows people to work with a professional team to build solutions around interests and goals rather than the law and competitive bargaining. It's hard to explain in a sentence or two, but
we'll get into it, I think, a little bit. I do.
Yeah.
Let me preface this by telling everyone we want this to be Frances's observations as she's worked with all of these couples of positive financial concepts. Divorce will be part of it, but it's not meant to be any legal advice. This webcast, though Frances is a lawyer, it's not meant to be legal advice. There is the Q&A section that you can add if you have a question, we'll address those at the end of the session. But so feel free to use that. Frances, well, let's jump in. So in terms of collaborative law, what is that? Is it everybody sitting together at the round table, and what is it?
Well, it's a paradigm shift. First of all, it is a shift away from an adversarial system and lens through which to look at the conflict. It's intended to help people to tap into their goodwill and the goodwill that the relationship had when it started, in an effort to restructure the family out of respect for the fact that the family will continue to be a family even though it's not under one roof anymore. Mm-hmm. The idea was born in the mind of a brilliant lawyer in Minnesota who was sick of the fact that every single solitary client that he had was unhappy, regardless of whether their case was tried or mediated or settled amicably. Everybody was miserable and mad. And he decided that there had to be a better way. His idea was to create settlement specialists so that lawyers could be hired for the sole purpose of negotiating, in the hopes that that would change the sort of carrots and sticks that get thrown around in the process. And in other words, if the lawyers can't litigate your case, which is the cornerstone of collaborative. If you hire a collaborative lawyer, they are there to help you settle. If you don't succeed, you have to go hire someone else to litigate your case.
Okay.
And that gives everybody the same skin in the game. Mm-hmm. And so it's a function of a limited scope representation as a lawyer, but your focus is to help the couple reach an agreement.
If you're a collaborative lawyer, if I've hired a collaborative lawyer, I would have to have the adversary, if we call it that, would also agree to work with a collaborative lawyer.
Yes, both parties have to have representation in the collaborative process. And collaborative divorce is not something people just do because they're good negotiators. It requires special training. And it's a lot of training because it's a paradigm shift and it requires a different set of sort of focuses and priorities and skill sets, to be frank. But as the idea grew, the concept was built from just using lawyers in the process to also using financial advisor and mental health professionals. So everyone who participates is trained in the collaborative model, and everyone who participates is really kind of shifting their own professional paradigm, because a financial advisor in this role is not giving financial advice. They are being a marshal of the financial information and the financial decision-making process for the couple, facilitating the kind of sharing of information that people need to make informed choices. And the mental health professionals aren't therapists, they're coaches. So it's a little bit of a shift for everybody.
Sure. Let's take a little bit of a step back from that. As through your learning with all of this, what are some of the things that you've seen that help to, before we even get to divorce, what are things that you've seen couples do to be able to go through a path a little bit better, whether they stay married or not? What are some strong financial conversations that really come to mind?
Well, I think the way I would put it is that I would say that my work over the course of my career as a divorce lawyer has taught me how little people talk about money and how often that creates conflict that leads to divorce. It's kind of shocking when you think about it. What could be more critical, central, and important to building a family and a life together than your relationship with money? And yet it's a taboo topic. It's something that people don't talk about. I find in the work that I do to help people draft prenuptial agreements, it's an opportunity, I think, for them to have those conversations. And so I think people can tend to see prenuptial agreements as sort of, I don't know, like people don't want to draft a will because it means they're going to die. People don't want to talk about a prenup because it means they're going to get a divorce. And in fact, that's not the way I look at it. I look at it through the lens of, this is an opportunity for you to share with one another your goals, your expectations, your priorities. And those are all things that help build healthy relationship. So I think it's a disaster that is waiting to happen when people aren't able to talk about money in a healthy way.
How have you been able to kind of shift the way that people look at prenuptial agreements to make it more of a positive? Like, how do you drive that conversation?
Well, I think when I meet with people who are interested in having one, and particularly those who have some trepidation about it or fear around it, and those would often be the party to the relationship who's not the moneyed spouse, but who's the one who's been asked to participate in the process. I encourage them that this is an opportunity for them to look at the relationship through some different lenses. Love can make us blind, love can make us crazy, and how important it is to be upfront about what our expectations are. We don't want to have a situation where a moneyed spouse comes to a vulnerable spouse and says, hey, sign this thing, which essentially says, you coming in with nothing, you're going out with nothing. Like, that's not fair.
Right.
You need to be able to advocate for yourself. If that's not fair going in, how's it going to be fair coming out?
So as you're going through a lot of these discussions, some of it must be hard, but what do you do, or what kind of techniques can you guide to make it more of a positive conversation? If somebody does feel like they're being a little bit more bullied, because I'm thinking, taking that back to, okay, here I can have this relationship, I'm worried to have it, but I can use these tips to really be able to make it more positive.
Well, it depends. If we are approaching the prenup from a collaborative process, then we're going to use all the tools we use in collaboration, which means we are making the parties focus on what their goals and interests are. What you're essentially trying to do is get people to talk about the feelings
Mhm.
The feelings that should be the guide. For example, I doubt there's any moneyed spouse who wants to marry someone who's vulnerable, who really wants to have the feeling that they're depriving their spouse of a decent life. That's
Right,
not a feeling that they're seeking.
right.
But if we don't talk about that, the reality of that is never brought home.
Yeah.
So often I think if you can shift the focus from what is fair, or what am I entitled to, or well, I didn't earn it, he did. If you can shift it away from that to what kind of life do you want to lead? What are your priorities? How do you feel about debt? Are you risk averse? Do you have a lot of debt? Are you comfortable with debt? What kinds of ways do you want to prioritize the spending of money versus the savings of money? I
Mhm.
mean, these are topics that almost without exception will lead to conflicts that end marriages when they aren't had.
I mean, it's interesting even thinking, I love that thought of like, what are your goals, and taking away like the 60% or what are our goals? How are, let's being able to work together for those? Cause that completely does change the conversation. As you've had these conversations with clients, do you find that most of the time, even if it gets a little heated, like just the fact of having the conversations is helping to get people to a better place?
I hope so. I mean, I'm not able to like follow people all the way through their
Right,
lives. And
right.
and I stay in touch with a lot of clients, but I can't say in terms of outcome, but I do know that it is often possible for people to have conversations they wouldn't have had.
Right.
And that
What
alone has got to be an improvement.
what about if you're having that conversation? Let's bring up something that you just brought up. Like, are you debt averse, or are you okay? And I'm like, no, I pay off every credit card. I want to save all my money. I like squirrel it away because that is actually true. And I'm such a miser. But then the other party is like, I think we should enjoy. Like we should, like, life is long. How is how do you work to reconcile that? Or are there certain red flags that you're like, whoa?
Well, I wish that I was in a position to get in that far with people. We often really barely scratch the surface in the function of developing a prenuptial agreement, because there's so much law and legal stuff that comes into play.
Mhm.
But I think that compromise is probably the key to everything, and I think opposites often attract.
Mhm.
And so I think if people can recognize at the outset that they have these differences, and they can work to find compromise so that the miser isn't so miserly that everyone's miserable, and the spender isn't so spendy that nobody has anything to
Mhm.
retire with,
Right.
then you found something that is rewarding out of this process. I mean, my own experience in my own life is often that the ways in which my spouse is opposite for me is an opportunity for me to stretch towards that direction, and for him to stretch in my direction, so that we each meet in a more moderate place. I think that would be the goal of every relationship.
Right. If you're on a solid way to be able to talk about things. And again, I feel like thinking of it as thinking through goals as opposed to exact dollars helps to be able to make that conversation a little bit more positive. Is anybody a good candidate for going through working with a collaborative divorce? Like, what if, gosh, this is getting really dark, but like if there's an abusive, or like, can anybody work through a collaborative divorce process?
Yeah, pretty much anybody can work through a collaborative divorce process. I would say some are going to be trickier than others. The goal of the process and the goal of the team is to kind of balance the imbalances of power
Mhm.
and to shore up the relational difficulties in a way that enable the couple to focus on the future and those decisions that need to be made. I would say that collaborative divorce is a spectrum, just like pretty much anything in life. And There are people who can have a transformational experience if they come into the process very open-minded with a lot of goodwill and a lot of resilience and sort of flexibility in their view of things. But when you have rigid thinkers, when you have somebody who, here's an example, let's say, the husband is taking the trash out every day of the marriage, but today he took it out because he's hiding something from me. And that sort of thinking, when it is rigid and cannot be reframed for a person, that kind of person is going to really struggle in the collaborative model, because we want to work to help people reframe things in a more positive and forgiving light. If we jump to the most negative conclusion every time something happens that we really don't know the explanation for, then we're going to have a whole bunch of extraneous conflict that's going to cost a lot of money and make the process less successful.
Again, that's just a take that you can do with every day, like kind of approaching this, not thinking the worst. And now that's tough sometimes when you're going through a divorce, like, it's a dark hole. So I imagine at least having somebody that's like a little bit of a reality check of like, okay, let's, that's
yeah, like this is normal. This is normal.
Yeah.
This is not normal. Yeah. That you're overthinking that. You're underthinking this. Yeah. Having someone who can help you with that, I think, can be invaluable, especially if you're open to that.
Yes. You have to, right.
There's no one who's getting a divorce who's like in a great place. Like there's no such thing as an easy divorce. That doesn't exist. And there's no such thing as winning. That's just absurd. That offends me, the very concept of that.
There's a lot of losing though. There's a lot of losing. So I guess it's like, the ability to say, can we work together? Having gone through an absolutely terrible divorce, like just the petty, and I'm not going to get in, but like to your point, it's the petty rabbit holes because people aren't talking. You're avoiding a lot of that kind of stuff just by being somebody to be that third party sounding board, it sounds like.
Well, it's very typical and it's very normal for people in divorce to only see what they're giving up and not to see what they're getting. It's very normal. It's very typical. But I think it can be helpful to have a lawyer who will remind you, but wait, your highest priority was X. That's been achieved. That cost the spouse something. That was a give. It's easy to lose sight of that. And so what you focus on becomes your reality. And if your focus is loss, then everything is a loss.
Again, that's another take back. Like if you go into any conversation, whether it's about money or whatever, for the win, that's a loss, right? That's a loss. So
one of my favorite lines is, you can be right or you can be in relationship, but you cannot have both.
There you go. We do have a couple questions. I'm going to want to ask one of them. So when do you recommend to initiate financial conversations, and what are some good questions to start with if you're in a relationship, or at what point, like day one, date two, or
you're giving me a platform to speak to a population of people I don't often speak to. And I think, what I would say is, before you plan the wedding, let's have some straight talk, and let's be willing to walk away if it's not a good fit. Before the flowers are ordered and the photographer deposit has been made, before you've started to create those sunken costs that are hard to walk away from, I think it would be smart to have conversations around things like, what do you think is a reasonable budget for a vacation in a year? Or what is your attitude about travel? How much credit card debt do you have? Do you like to pay off your credit cards every month? Yeah. Just some pretty standard basic stuff. Do you live on a budget? Do you like to budget? Is that important to you? If that's important to me, is that a problem for you? Are you willing to cooperate with me in doing that. Especially if you are a person who knows yourself well, and if you're not, you need to get on that job.
Right.
Yeah, because
Right.
marriage is going to be more successful among people who know themselves better. But I think if you know yourself well and you know the things that are triggers for you that trigger your anxiety around money, or that you know the things that are really important to you, those are the topics that you should pursue in conversation.
So I'm going to go to another question here that was sent in. So with that, let's say, no, we're not going to talk about divorce. Maybe someday, but no, we're going to have a prenup just because it puts us on the same page. What are some of the things, and I love that, like knowing yourself and just having that conversation. What are some of the things that you would want to include in a prenup, or what shouldn't you? And because it does sound like it's just a method of getting it all out on the table that helps to have those good combos.
Well, I mean, generally prenuptial and postnuptial agreements can be divided into sort of 3 buckets of topics. One is what happens when you die, one is what happens when you divorce, and the other is sort of like a cohabitation agreement. What are your expectations of one another during the marriage? Within those sort of big buckets, there are categories. Obviously, at death, you have different concerns than at divorce, because the assumption is that if you're married at the time someone dies, you may be living in a shared home. You may be living in a home that's owned by the person who died.
Mm-hmm.
You want to talk about that. Obviously we don't want a widow to be thrown out of her home. So we've got to deal with that sort of thing in the death subject. People can generally pick and choose. They can decide they're going to punt the death conversation, and that will just be dictated by their last will and testament. Or they may punt what are their expectations during the marriage and just address divorce and death. It's sort of a la carte kind of a situation. But in divorce, obviously, that is the most fraught conversation. And that is probably the most typical reason why people want a prenup or a postnup. And sometimes a postnup is consideration for reconciliation of a marriage. So sometimes people are at the precipice of divorce. They decide to try to reconcile. There's goodwill between them, but they're not necessarily relying on that to last. And so they want some reassurance, and a postnup can be that.
Yeah.
And obviously you want to talk about support if that's an issue. If someone is dependent, you want to talk about housing. You want to talk about how your separate assets are handled and defined, and how any joint assets are handled and defined. I think that's probably as specific as I could be. Now in Alabama, and I presume in most states, you cannot decide custody issues or child support issues in that kind of a contract, because the courts have an overarching obligation to ensure the well-being of the children, and that invades the province of the court.
Yeah. I'm thinking, like even just the process of talking through, well, we may or may want a prenup. It's that first step of talking about finances. And to your point, we should have done it at the beginning, but what if, so we're married, but marriage is good, but everything's great, but I'm still like, the money thing keeps coming up. What do you suggest? How do you get a conversation started? Do you think it's helpful? A lot of what I'm hearing is having a mediator, having somebody, a collaborative lawyer who can be that sounding board. So somebody that feels vulnerable may have somebody to be able to say, let's take this.
And therapists, I mean, oftentimes therapists can help facilitate these challenging conversations between people. I mean, I think we live in a world where people, for the most part, avoid conflict. People, for the most part, avoid tricky, hard conversations. There's a fear of loss. There's a sense of scarcity. There's all these reasons why people avoid these sort of conversations. And I think what's sad about that is that the things we avoid become our reality. It's like we bring them into being by trying to avoid them. We can't hide from this stuff. You know, if you are finding yourself unable to sleep at night, or, you know, unable to eat, or whatever, totally distracted by the fact that you have $20,000 in credit card debt and you never have before, and that's something that you never wanted, and it's a problem for you, I think that, you know, people need to gather themselves together and speak straight.
Mhm.
This is unacceptable to me.
Mhm.
I'm not good with this. We need to
Yeah.
talk about some solutions around this.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not at a place right now where I feel like divorce is imminent. You know, we're not there, but I need to let you know that if these kinds of problems continue to crop up between us, I'm afraid that it will become
Yeah.
an issue.
Yeah.
You know, nobody wants to be threatened. And, you know, obviously to get to the ultimatum conversation, you got to be further down the road. But if we can start addressing these issues earlier.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that people are sort of reluctant to do is just articulate very plainly what our expectations are.
It goes
You
back
know,
to that goal. It goes back to the goal, and it's not winning. It's you know, like, I'm nervous about this because we have this goal of having a lake house in 5 years or whatever.
yeah.
Really.
And then accountability. I mean, we can't just sleep on someone ignoring a promise that they've made. You know, if someone makes a promise to do something and they don't do it time after time, then that's got to be a hard conversation. And my own personal experience, I can tell you that this sort of was an issue in my marriage that is now almost 35 years long. And for years and years, every time the recognition that the promise was broken, I got furious. I literally lost my mind. I would scream and curse. That is completely ineffective. I'm
Mhm.
sorry, that was a complete fail on my part.
Mhm.
But the time that I simply said, I'm so disappointed. This is a promise you made to me.
Mhm.
I've always felt like I could trust you. This has broken my trust,
Mhm.
and I don't know where to go from here.
Mhm.
When I had that conversation, never happened again.
Well, it's also, you had a conversation, right? Like, you could be sitting there stewing about this credit card debt and bring it up, and the other party say, I had no idea that this was bought. Like, yeah, let's talk about it. So I feel like it seems like it's just as often and early as you can to be able to have those having
And in holding someone accountable, it's important to talk about how you feel, not to talk about what they
what
did.
they did. Yes.
Yeah.
So
Instead of making accusations,
yeah.
you have to be vulnerable and authentic.
And that's a question just came in. How do we hold our partner accountable without being a nag? Talk about, this is how it made me feel, not this is what you did. That's what you would.
I was surprised. I saw this charge on the credit card, not sure what that's about. Do you know anything about it? No assumptions.
Yeah.
It's a curious question. I don't
Yeah.
know what the hell's going on. I mean, people steal people's credit cards all the time. It might have been some third party weirdo. You don't know. So don't make assumptions, ask questions. And every assumption can become a question.
Here's another one that's not about divorce, but about if you keep finances separate after marriage, what are important things to do to protect yourself? I'm sure this is a conversation that couples have with you. Is it better to keep separate finances? Is it better to have like a smaller accounts? Have you seen one yield more successful results than another?
No.
Okay.
I think that's a personal choice. It doesn't affect the division of property in Alabama under the law. But I would say that if you are a person who wants to keep your finances separate, you are probably a person who wants a prenuptial agreement.
Right. So then at least you'd have some of the conversations about shared expectations. So
Yeah.
if I want to pursue working with a collaborative lawyer, and is there a difference, Frances, between working with a collaborative lawyer and working with a mediator?
Yes, there is a difference. Those are not the same hat. A mediator is simply a facilitator of compromise.
Mhm.
It's a completely different skill set from being a collaborative advocate. So a collaborative advocate is, is your lawyer. A
Mhm.
mediator doesn't represent anybody.
That makes it clear. How do I find a collaborative lawyer? How do I find, if that's the path I want to take?
Probably the best way to find a collaborative lawyer at this juncture, I don't, I may be shooting myself in the foot here, but there is an International Academy of Collaborative Professionals that has a website that lists by state members of that organization, all of whom would have to be collaboratively trained. That would be sort of a central clearinghouse for those sorts of names. Beyond that, I think probably word of mouth, websites, that sort of thing would be, the way that you would find it.
Well, and it's interesting, a lot of our attendees here are either advisors or clients of advisors. I would imagine that would be a good symbiotic relationship. We talked about with a collaborative lawyer process, it's helpful to have an advisor there. So maybe an advisor would know someone who is a part of it. But you were saying the advisor as well has to be trained through this collaborative process.
Well, and somebody who is a couple's financial advisor cannot be their collaborative financial neutral.
Right.
Because we would want the financial person on the collaborative team to be unaffiliated.
Right. Right.
We don't want them to have any relationships that would muddy their ability to be neutral and
Right.
to simply be sort of the expert at the table to explain what are the long-term ramifications of this choice versus that choice. How would you assess the tax implications to this choice versus that choice? Just basic, fundamental, broad stroke kind of neutral advice is what you're seeking.
And we're going to see if anybody else, we had a couple questions come in that we addressed. If we'll give another minute or two for if anybody else wants. I'm sort of famous for pulling the trigger on these things and then all the questions come in right at the end. So I want to make sure people have a chance to get their question in. Francis, is there something that I missed asking you about that you want to make sure that folks understand? Is there some success story in your, feel like we talked a little more about divorce than maybe we wanted to, but I mean, that's obviously the result of not having these strong conversations and solid conversations. Any big success story that you want to cover?
Well, I think, in the collaborative process, I've had everything from one end of the spectrum to the other. I had probably the most rewarding collaborative divorce that I was ever involved in. The parties had started in litigation and converted to collaboration, which you can do. You just can't do the opposite with the same lawyer. Yeah. And it had been a very challenging process. We had reached an agreement that had been signed, but the judge had not yet signed a final judgment of divorce, and the wife turned up pregnant. Very complicated situation under Alabama law. The husband was the legal father of the child by virtue of their marital status. So we had to come back to the collaborative table to figure out what are we gonna do about this. And it was a beautiful experience to be a part of a couple extending the kind of goodwill that we saw in that situation, in worrying about how this child's life might be different than their siblings by virtue of this, unintended consequence. And all kinds of ideas were floated, including the possibility that the mother would put the child up for adoption, which was ultimately what she did. And it became this beautiful story that the family could tell their children, that mom is having a baby for people who can't have their own. And it just, I still get goosebumps talking about it. It was, an incredible experience.
Because everyone was thinking of everyone's greater good instead of
winning.
Right.
Thinking of the broader, greater good instead of, themselves selfishly alone. I mean, people were having to think about themselves and their own ability to give, but at the same time, there was so much goodwill. And I'm telling you, this was not a relationship that had not been, I mean, there had been potential infidelity, there had been breaches of trust, there had been, all kinds of problems that could
They were able to-
derail people.
Yeah.
So it's all about your attitude and state of mind. But then, I had one where it blew up, I don't know, maybe 2 meetings into the process, when somebody decided they were just, you know what, I'm going off on my RV for, 6 months and I'll check with y'all later. Yeah,
Oh,
just,
oh.
not gonna participate in the process.
Yeah.
So, I've seen the whole spectrum.
Sure. Well, I wish I had you back in the day, Frances. But I mean, I think the goal is, I am taking away, don't go in to try to win, because that's a sure sign to lose. And just being able to talk kind of honestly, like, this is my feeling, so that somebody, and maybe they say, well, you're totally wrong. But this is how I'm feeling. Because
Right.
that's a good way to start a discussion without, like you say, nagging, accusing, or anything. So, oh, wait, somebody else just did ask one more question. Any tips on how to process and work through emotions around money for oneself with the situation of knowing intellectually you have enough? Yes, I would like to know this answer, please. So like, and you're talking about how do you know yourself? So like, how do you work through some of those questions?
Well, I'll tell you how I do it. First of all, I have the most phenomenal financial advisor, and she's the one that talks me off the ledge when I have a panic attack. So you need a person like that in your life.
Yeah.
You need someone who can give you reassurance that it's going to be okay, even when you lose hundreds of thousands of dollars in the market.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's key. I think, because I think it's also like, that's what a lot of our advisors do. That's their role, of having those conversations, as opposed to like just making investment decisions. So having someone you trust to give you that perspective. Love that.
Yeah.
All right, Frances, thank you so much for taking some time with us. This was really
Absolutely
extraordinarily helpful. And I would thank everybody for joining us. Please reach out to your financial advisor if you have additional questions. Please reach out to me if you need anything else, and have a lovely rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.